Hello, everyone. I'm June Marfori, one of the directors, trainers, and also a senior consultant for POWERinU. And I welcome you to POWERinU's complimentary webinar entitled Building a Digitally Proficient Talent Bench. I'd like now to introduce our speaker for this webinar. Our speaker, Dette Aruego, is currently the Managing Director of Assessment Analytics, Incorporated, or AAI. Her more than 20 years of work experience includes leadership positions in other organizations, as well as managing her own company. Her background in company management is coupled with her extensive experience in operations and sales and marketing with some of the largest banking institutions in the country. Dette has been actively involved in AAI's competency-based projects with various multinational and local corporations. She was certified in the United Kingdom as an SHL accredited trainer. This qualifies her to conduct all SHL talent management training programs worldwide. Moreover, she has also been certified in Assessment and Development Center Design, Assessor Training, Competency Design and Job Analysis, Competency-Based Interviewing, 360-degree or multi-rater feedback, and in Personality and Ability Assessment. Dette has also been certified by the British Psychological Society as test user of Occupational Ability and Personality Assessment. Everyone, let us now all welcome our speaker, Dette Aruego.
So good evening, everyone, or depending on where you are, good morning or good afternoon. Thank you, June, for that kind introduction and for inviting me here tonight. So the topic of our webinar today revolves around digitalization and its impact on talent. As you all know, digital transformation is everywhere. I think we can all agree that there are huge structural shifts happening in most, if not all, industries around the world. But these shifts are actually not new. From the first industrial revolution's introduction of steam-powered factories and the application of science to mass production and manufacturing in the second industrial revolution, and the beginning of automation and digitization in the third industrial revolution, and now with the continuous rise of technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics, the way we do things have definitely changed and will continue to evolve. In fact, in a report made by the World Economic Forum, The Future of Jobs, they say that artificial intelligence and automation will create a net of 60 million new jobs by 2022. So what they've seen is that 75 million jobs may be displaced due to a shift in division of labor between humans and machines, but then at the same time, 133 million new jobs will be created. So that's a net of about 60 million net new jobs by 2022. Clearly, jobs in terms of how, where, and when we work are profoundly changing. The future of work is now, and it's rooted in a tidal wave of digitalization. And because of this, 87% of business executives agree that digitalization is a priority for their company, while 67% of executives believe that their organizations must become more digital to remain competitive. So in light of all of these, what I would like to be able to share tonight are insights on what this means to us in terms of building and strengthening our talent bench in this digital era. What I will be doing is to first walk you through the characteristics of a high digital environment, discuss some talent objectives that are critical for success in a digital environment, and also provide some strategy ideas to implement coming from some research and studies that SHL has done. So SHL is a company based in the UK. It's a talent expert with over 40 years of experience, and us here who belong to with Assessment Analytics are very proud to be the exclusive distributor of SHL here in the Philippines. So I'll also be discussing with you some myths and truths around what matters and what works in a digital business environment, as well as understand what digital proficiency is and how we can assess for it. Now, before we even go there, I think it is also very important for us to define what is digitalization. Earlier, I talked about the four industrial revolutions and how the current trends around technology are greatly affecting us. There's artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, robotics, e-commerce, and a lot more. And we see these do not just have impact to us in terms of business or at work, but it also affects us in terms of our personal lives. Definitely, new digital technologies are one of the driving forces behind some of the fastest rising organizations in the world today. So we're all aware, of course, of Amazon, Google, Netflix, and I'm sure a lot of you don't even probably watch TV anymore, but watch movies and films through streaming. And then, of course, there's Uber, or in our case, it's really more of Grab, and even Airbnb. And these organizations are setting the pace for many other companies. But it's not really just isolated to them. In fact, it's actually affecting almost every industry. So, as mentioned earlier, because of this, most business executives stated that digitalization is a priority for them. We also found that more than half of the executives in every single industry sector agree with that statement. But what I want to be able to point out is digitalization is not just about new technologies. Of course, they are an enabler, but it's actually about how these new technologies are being used to develop new business models and how these new business models are creating new revenue generating opportunities. That's really the heart of what's going on. It's about making major changes, moving towards not just digital, but customer first business strategies and the products and services that align with them. In short, digitalization is creating entirely new digital business environments in which our organizations and people who work there have to do their work. Now, I'd like to build on that point of business environment and what they look like when we go on to the next slide. So, if you look at different organizations, digitalization shows up in many different ways. But as SHL has looked across them through their studies, there were four common characteristics that stood out. The first one is the high degree of change. Competitors, markets, organizations that are stakeholders are always changing. And the second key characteristic that we've seen is there's a high degree of business transformation, significantly altering how the business creates or captures value in the marketplace has become a top imperative. Third is technology and its intensity. Technology used in the industries that we're looking at is rapidly evolving and generating those market opportunities. And last but not least is a very strong emphasis on innovation. So the focus is really on introducing or significantly improving products or processes in a way that fundamentally changes competitive positioning. So what's important for us today in our roles is to think about the implications of these digital environments or how our organizations operate, but also how work is done and the context in which employees do their jobs. So at the heart of the business strategy is the people strategy. Really, how through the talent the organization can achieve success in this environment. Which now raises that important question about what is that right talent? And what is it today fundamentally different from what it was yesterday? Before we proceed, I'd like to go through a short survey. So, coming from the four key characteristics that we talked about, can you kindly select the aspect of today's digital business environment that is presenting the greatest challenge for your organization today? So just choose one out of these four. Is it the high rate of change, high degree of business transformation, technology intensive, or focus on innovation? So I'll give you about 20 seconds to choose which among these is presenting the greatest challenge to your organization today. And okay, so now let's look at the responses. So thank you for your responses. Just waiting to see what they are. So it looks like it's a good mix among the four. So some have rated, I think, highest by just a bit is high degree of business transformation, and then we have high rate of change, technology intensive, and focus on innovation. So later on, as we go through the rest of the webinar, hopefully you'll be able to get insights on how you can navigate through these different types of environments as we go on later. Okay, so thank you. So now, coming from these, let's turn to what this actually means in terms of our talent and the results from the research that SHL has done. What SHL has found from looking across hundreds of organizations and thousands of managers, leaders, employees that we've worked with and assessed inside these organizations is that today's talent must, of course, become digitally proficient. But what does that exactly mean? So, as we were looking at this profile, what we saw is that many of the same skills and attributes that we value today will also be critical to embrace and succeed in a world of digitalization. There is actually very little evidence that the skills and competencies required today are entirely new. Of course, there are some competencies that have somehow become more important for some roles, while there are others that have declined in terms of importance. But in every case that SHL has examined and every role that they've looked at, it's almost always the same case of well-known competencies that are now just being applied to different contexts, different processes, new information, and resources in the context of those challenges that we just outlined. So, to quote a familiar saying, it's really just about having old wine in new bottles, meaning there are particular sets of competencies that may not be necessarily or are not totally new that will enable employees to become digitally proficient given the performance requirements or objectives that they now need in these contexts of new challenges. So let's talk about what those performance requirements are. Again, looking at thousands of organizations, we've identified four primary objectives or requirements that digital talent need to achieve or share in providing success to the organization. They're oriented around the organizational capabilities required for digital business models. And as you can see on the screen in front of you, they include continuous learning and innovation, execution excellence, insightful analytics, and network performance. I'll be providing more details on these objectives in a moment, but I just want to emphasize that these objectives set the requirements for the profile of the digital talent organizations need to succeed. Now, building on this point, let's take a closer look and see what this means in terms of specific behaviors and competencies. So you can see on this slide the behaviors or competencies necessary to perform well against the four digital talent objectives. Now, these competencies, if nurtured in the right ways, are the key to propelling business growth and developing those new product lines or entering new markets. Now, in the interest of time, I won't really be able to cover all of these in detail, but what I'd like to do is share some highlights. So, let's first take a look at continuous learning. So that's the first green circle that you see there. Here we find that for continuous learning and innovation, what we need are employees who can adapt, who can learn effectively and innovate to drive their organizations forward. Then now, if you look at the blue circle called network performance, we now see that we now require employees who can build productive relationships, collaborate, and influence others to boost the performance of their colleagues. And then, of course, it's not just their colleagues, but also their organization and ultimately their customers. And then on the very far right, you see insightful analytics, which now requires employees who can apply their analytical and reasoning skills to use the technology effectively and the data that surrounds it to create new insights. So I'm sure a lot of you feel this, the new work environment where there is such an enormous amount of data and information. And what we need now are employees who can also detect which among these numerous information are needed and are critical. So As you look across this profile, you will find that it consists of competencies that we already know drive the performance of most employees. Complex problem solving, creative thinking, cognitive abilities, social skills, and process skills. And I think many of us can take comfort in the fact that we do not really have to dramatically redefine our competency models and frameworks to be able to find and know what this profile looks like. At the same time, it's also good to note that some of these competencies are easier to build than others, like decision making, collaboration, planning, and organizing skills. And now, as we're all aware, the move towards digitalization is one that is widely talked about and highly hyped. I'm sure this is not the first webinar you've joined that talks about digitalization, and a lot of conferences that are being held these days are really about the digital era. But what we found also is amidst all of these discussions and hype, unfortunately, it has also produced a lot of misperceptions and faulty assumptions around the digital talent. And we'll be taking a look at some of these faulty assumptions in a moment. Now, before we go there, I'd like you to also now go through a short survey, and please let me know in among the leaders within your organization. So just choose. For many leaders within my organization believe that agility is the most important attribute for digital talent. Is this true for your organization or false? So very quickly, maybe in 10 to 15 seconds, if you can please select for leaders within your organization, do they believe that agility is the most important attribute for digital talent? Survey to come on. It's an even split. So some say true, and for their organizations, they believe that agility is the most important attribute. And for the rest of our joiners tonight, it's false. So it's actually an even split. So it's very interesting to note. So this is the first myth that is related to digital talent. And it's actually the myth that is most widespread. Talking to a lot of organizations, a lot of them actually say that they think that the most essential employee attribute is agility. So what we're hearing is there is an ideal talent profile that defines an employee that is really agile enough to perform effectively in any role using any technology and in any situation. And all we really have to do is find or build employees with this one size fits all agile profile, and they'll be able to succeed no matter what your digital business strategy looks like. And the most common version of this myth maintains that learning agility is the key to unlocking all the other competencies required by digitalization. They even say that it's actually the missing ingredient to the secret sauce for digital talent. So that's what people feel, or that's what people are saying, that the most essential employee attribute is agility. Now, how does that look like in terms of reality? So the reality that we found does not really support this claim. So yes, it's true that the ability to adapt to ambiguity and new ways of doing things and working in different cultures is an important attribute for any employee and leader in today's rapidly changing work environment. But that truly agile employee, the one who can succeed in any situation, it's what they call the classic purple unicorn. Our research shows that these people simply do not exist by nature. And we cannot simply create them by saying, like exposing them to have enough experiences that they can become fully agile no matter what comes down the road. Instead, recent studies have shown that how rapidly employees learn or how learning agile they are is far less important than how effectively they apply what they learn. So how well they're enabled to use the skills and competencies they already have in these new contexts. We're not saying that it's not important, but what we're saying is that it is not as important as how effectively they are able to apply what they learn. I'd like to now bring you to another short survey. So this time, um, if you can let me know, does your organization have a defined criteria and process for identifying high potentials? So simply reply with a yes or a no. So again, very quickly, maybe about 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds. So let's see. So the poll is done. We're just seeing. Okay, so we see here that slightly a bit more have said no. So in terms of having a defined criteria and process for identifying high potentials, it seems that uh, some already have a defined way of identifying high potentials, but there are quite a lot or more of our joiners tonight who still do not have that way of being able to identify their high potentials within their organization. So that's good. So we see that it's actually a mix. And in terms of organizations that we've dealt with, some of them also spend a lot of time in terms of making sure that they have the right talents for the digital era. And part of this is being able to identify high potential. So some of you already have this in place, while some of you probably will still be setting this up. So there are some organizations also who already have a method in terms of identifying high potentials, but are still in the process of questioning their existing models or frameworks for identifying their most critical talent. Now, how this relates to the second myth goes like this. So the second myth goes as we need to identify and develop a different type of high potential because digitalization now requires a different type of leader. And that's really based on the idea that the uncertainty around future leadership or future leadership roles require a different way of defining high potentials. So again, we need a new type of leader and therefore a new high potential model. How does that now look like in terms of reality? So a closer look at reality does not really support this argument. What I'd like to be able to do now is look at this from the point of view of SHL's three-part model of high potential, which defines successful high potential employees in terms of not just their ability, but also in terms of their aspiration and their engagement. So earlier, we looked at the core competencies or capabilities of top talent, and that we saw that they're not fundamentally different from what they've been in the past. So what is more important is really how they are applying what they know how to do and using their skills and their competencies in this new digital context. So now, how about in terms of aspirations and engagement? Well, our research finds that no matter what the work environment is, or the context, or even the digital business strategy, the most successful high potentials demonstrate the same aspiration and the same engagement to be able to perform in future leadership roles. So, what has changed really is not necessarily how we identify who these high potential talents are, but it's really their development. So their development now becomes more of a journey that they have to take one that they take one step at a time. It's more about how we can look ahead to each high potential's next role and then focus on defining the specific challenges of that digital context around that role and then provide the development experiences that build their readiness for those challenges. So it's not so much in terms of identification, but being able to um, provide them with developmental opportunities that will help them uh, prepare themselves for the next role that they're going towards. So very quickly, our last polling question for this evening. So can you see the question? It's which of the following do most people in your organization believe is the most important determinant for long-term success for digital talent? So in your organization, is it general work experience? Is it technical skills? Or is it interpersonal skills? So very quickly, let me know or let us know which of the following do most people in your organization believe is the most important determinant for long-term success for your digital talent. Okay, so the survey is completed. Let's see what Okay, so good. We see that it's actually almost an even mix among the three with slightly more on interpersonal skills. And I'm very happy to see that because um, our third myth actually talks about how for some they think the lack of technical skills make candidates unemployable. There are organizations who are caught up in this myth and believe that the most important talent for them to attract, hire, develop, and retain is technical talent. And when they look at the pace of new technology, they assume that most employees don't have or can't acquire the technical skills they need quickly enough. Well, of course, there are some roles such as, data scientists, which might be unique in this regard and do need to be hired outside the organization. But this is not necessarily true for all roles. So looking at the reality or the reality standpoint of where talents are today and what they look like, we actually see that surrounding the availability of digital talent, it really paints a very different picture. Again, while most jobs do require some technical skills, most of the competencies required to be successful in today's digital business environment are not technical skills at all. So remember, we showed those four circles and the competencies earlier. They're often softer, people centered skills like learning, creativity, critical thinking, and collaboration. So there's no technologically savvy employee today who will succeed in today's business environment without those competencies. We're not saying that the technical skills are not important, but what we're saying is if it's just those, then it will be very difficult for these employees to succeed. They still need the other competencies to be able to succeed in this kind of digital context. The other point to take into consideration here is that employees do not just work with new technologies just when they're doing their jobs. There's a growing use of technologies also outside the workplace. So most individuals already carry in technical skills when they go to work. A lot of us already have technical skills, such as even as simple as using our cell phone. And now a lot of us also collaborate with others using shared files, not just at work. So the line is really very blurry already. So to summarize, there are three myths that talk about agility, identifying our high potentials and technical skills, but the reality really shows otherwise. Um, and what is now important is what do we now do? So the key to really being able to create a digital or develop a digitally proficient workforce is to be able to evolve from human judgment and intuition and also these myths that we talked about and really focus on more objective and science-based people insight. So I'd like to share four steps for creating a high-performing workforce. The first is of course to be able to understand and analyze the context of your own digital business environment. What are your core offerings? And what are the supporting roles that drive them? What is your business strategy? How does the business use technology to make it happen? What is competition doing? So once you have a clear view of the digital context in which employees and leaders need to perform, you now are able to gain clarity into what performance excellence will look like. Now, the second step is to be able to determine the competency requirements for your digital context. What's important for your talent? Develop relevant job analyses for a given role, function, and even geography, and then prioritize those competencies. And after now you've done that, the third step is to be able to identify, assess, select, develop, and accelerate your digital talent. So based on the contextual challenges that you have identified in the first step, and then once you understand the critical competencies that your talents need, that's when we can now begin to invest in talent solutions that are agile, nimble, and flexible enough to help your businesses be more successful. So it's really beginning to understand how do you unlock and accelerate that digital talent. So using talent strategies that support objective and holistic assessments of each person while of course constantly adapting to a changing work environment. So the fourth step is really to begin to think beyond the static use of key metrics, trouble spots, and year-on-year comparison, and begin to measure and demonstrate true business impact that can translate into results that our shareholders will also enjoy. So we can have analytic methods to help us see exactly where and when to focus our efforts, and then translating these results into narratives or even stories that can connect the business strategies to real decisions, actions, and outcomes. So showing management that our talent efforts resulted to business impact. These, in a nutshell, are the important steps that we can take in building a digitally proficient talent tool. Now, that's in terms of talents, but what about for our leaders? So what kind of leader do we need to succeed in the digital work environment? If we reflect back to the earlier slides, we identified 4 digital talent objectives. So those are continuous learning and innovation. Remember the circles: execution excellence, insightful analytics, and network performance. But above and beyond all of these, it's really network performance that is the most important. And this is because the work is largely about building, enhancing, and managing relationships inside and outside the organization. Now, over the years, SHL completed a massive study of almost 9,000 leaders from across 80 different companies and identified 27 different contextual challenges that drive business success. Now, half a dozen of these, there are 6 that you can see on the screen, of these different contextual challenges are those that drive digital leaders, or what are needed for digital leaders. So if you can see, coming from deliver rapidly changing products, services, and processes, all the way to the right, deliver in high, uncertain, ambiguous context. These are the contextual challenges that matter for the performance of digital leaders. Leaders who are able to perform well in these challenges can boost business unit and revenue growth by even up to 12%. And they also can improve customer satisfaction by up to 20% and increase innovation by up to 68%. So these increases that I've mentioned were seen in the study that SHL made. So again, it's not about new or digital leaders, but really ensuring that our leaders are able to apply their skills and competencies in these contexts in order to succeed. So looking at these, I'd like to just be able to show you 2 out of the 6 as examples. So looking at 2 of these contextual challenges, which are grow the business through innovation and design and drive new technologies. So we can see that there are critical behaviors or competencies that our leaders need to thrive within these digital environments. And knowing this information, it now becomes somewhat easier to understand how we can then measure our talent against our future business objectives. So these may now more easily be measured using both performance and potential measures, such as, let's say, 360 feedback or assessment of potential. But what I'd like to emphasize, or what is important to know, is that it's critical that we rely on objective data versus subjective manager reviews. This is because we know that the world is shifting in how we get work done in almost every imaginable way, right? So it's very important that we are able to see from experience that if we just rely on subjective data, then the chance for success is very slim. It's no longer enough that we just look at performance management or visuals in terms of how people have done successfully in the past. We need more scientific and objective ways of measuring both performance and potential for us to better identify and develop our digital talent and digital leader bench. So to summarize tonight's discussion, we looked at the characteristics of a high digital environment and the common challenges encountered. So they're the high degree of change, technology intensive, high degree of business transformation, and high degree of innovation. We also talked about the three myths around digitalization and the truths or realities of for each of these. We also looked into talent objectives that are critical for success and the profile of both digital talent and leaders stemming from these. And for us to be able to reach our desired results in this fast-paced, complex, and increasingly digital world, the key things we need to do are to understand our workforce, take a closer look at which competencies are required for success in our own digital environment, be able to identify, assess, develop, and accelerate our digital talent and leaders so that they can thrive and reach higher levels of performance in our organizations. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I hope that I was able to share valuable insights with all of you this evening.
Thank you very much once again, Dette. Feel free to type in your questions at the chat box or just send a direct message to our moderator, POWERinU Philippines. Meanwhile, that very interesting talk, as you have just shared with us, something I quickly personally picked up is that learning agility is not the most critical attribute required for today's digital talent. A bit confusing for me in the sense that I think that in this world today of the VUCA environment, learning agility is actually very important. Can you explain a little bit about this, Deb?
Well, June, I'd like to emphasize that we're really not discounting learning agility totally. So definitely it's still important. But what we've seen or what SHL has seen in its research is that more than learning agility, it's really how talents are able to effectively apply what they learn that is more important. So of course, the world is constantly changing. So what is more important is being able to apply our learning in these different contexts that we're now facing. So more than the speed of how rapidly we learn, it's really more of the effective application of what we learn that is really now more important. So even for leaders, it's also very critical that we have flexible and agile leadership systems. So we can also apply these into the different challenges that we're now facing in our environment. I want to clarify that we're not saying learning agility is not important, but more of that it's not the most critical attribute. The most critical attribute that we've seen in the studies is that the application of learning in different contexts is now very crucial for us to be able to thrive in these environments that are constantly changing.
Thank you, Deb. That's helpful. There's a question that's come up there, and you can see it up on the screen. You mentioned that some competencies and skills earlier that are critical to meeting the digital talent objectives. What strategy would you suggest that we take in making sure we're able to get the profile of talents?
So the strategy that I'd like to be able to share is really the first thing that we need to do is first get to know our existing workforce. So that's very crucial. So it's only in profiling our existing workforce that we are able to identify where the gaps are. Now, after looking at these gaps, there's, of course, we have to see with our bench, with our talent bench, do we have people who we can actually develop? Or sometimes it really has to be a combination of a buy and build strategy. It's very difficult to avoid nowadays to buy. Of course, the ideal is to be able to build within, but sometimes it has to be both a buy and build strategy that we have to do simultaneously.
There's a question here that, based on our experience, what is the best tool for measuring performance and potential in the context of succession planning?
So in terms of succession planning, in terms of performance, so of course there are different tools that we can use for both performance and potential. And in terms of performance, one of the tools that we can use to add objectivity into the process is doing a 360 assessment. Sometimes if we rely on manager reviews alone, then there's a certain degree of subjectivity that comes into play. But with the 360, that is somehow also, uh, it becomes a bit more objective because you now have a combination of feedback coming from not just the managers, but also peers, as well as direct reports. Um, it's also very crucial that there are clear measurements, so of in terms of competency, so that everybody has the same, if we can call it a ruler, so to speak, that everybody is looking at. So that in terms of measuring now the talent in terms of performance, there's only one competency rubrics or competency ruler that we're looking at. In terms of potential, there are a lot of assessment solutions. One of one of the best tools that we also use is what we call an assessment center, because it becomes now a combination of not just one tool. So you can have your online assessments in terms of personality and being able to now assess our talents in terms of where they are or what their potential in terms of the competency, and also looking at how they would perform in a stretch activity. And that also helps in terms of being able to determine who among them will be able to perform in different types of situations. So thank you, Stephanie.
A question that has been asked is whether these four digital talent objectives also apply to leaders.
Well, yeah. So these four digital talent objectives also apply to leaders. Not necessarily in the same way, because of course, for leaders, aside from these four digital talent objectives, they also have to be able to effectively manage their teams who are who have to be digitally proficient and make sure that their teams are also able to succeed in their digital and changing environments. Um, the leaders also have a responsibility in terms of attracting and hiring and managing and retraining these talents. So I also want to be able to point out that among these four digital objectives, it's really network performance that is most important for leaders. And it's really because a lot of their work is about, again, building and managing relationships, not just inside the organization, but also externally. So what we've seen is in one of the studies that have been made, it's actually what we call enterprise leaders that are very successful in terms of being able to bring their team and ensure that they're able to thrive in the digital context.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank
Now
you.
that in your presentation you made mention of contextual leadership challenges, can you explain that a little bit more?
Okay, so again, in the studies that have been made, what we've seen is, of course, like in this VUCA world, so there are more demands that leaders have to face, and as they face more demands, their performance also suffers. And what we've seen is, even in the studies now, we've seen that leaders, about 50%, or 46% to be exact, as they move on to new roles, about 46% of these leaders actually fail. And it's because they're not well prepared in as to moving on to these new roles. So what we've seen is that in the study that I mentioned earlier with about 9,000 leaders, there are 27 different contexts that FHL was able to identify that present different kinds of challenges for leaders. And what we've seen is there are 6 of these, the ones I showed earlier, that are commonly faced when it comes to digital environments. And there are certain traits that leaders have that, if you look at their traits matched into these digital contexts,
they're
they're
actually
actually
able
able
to
to
thrive.
thrive.
So
So
what we're
what we're
seeing
seeing
is
is
that
that
out of
out
these
of these
27
27
contextual
contextual
challenges,
challenges,
there are
there are
actually
actually
certain
certain traits
traits that leaders have that could actually help them in facing these contextual challenges. And it's just a matter of being able to match who among these leaders have these certain traits that would allow them to succeed in such an environment.
Thank you once again. We have two questions here on the chat box. Now it's three. I'm not sure we can answer all three given the time, but maybe we'll just show the first one. And it asks about the four digital talent objectives, which you say the most important is network performance. So there's the question, in your experience, what kind of training do you recommend for L&D to facilitate, to create and transform the organization to have digitally proficient talents?
So this is the one, there's an echo, so I'll just read it again. In your experience, what kind of training do you recommend for L&D to facilitate as a starter, to create and transform the organization to have? So it's really about, earlier I mentioned that some of the skills and competencies are those that are not as difficult in terms of learning. And for network performance, what is good to see is a lot of these revolve around collaboration and influence in building relationships. And in terms of being able to provide learning and development, there are a lot of, what we have seen has worked is really more of exposure. It's not training. Of course, training in terms of actual face-to-face training still helps, but what we've seen is it's actually immersing them in activities at work. For example, putting them or giving them an activity such as a stretch activity that now allows them to collaborate with others and being able to, let's say, form or
coordinate with teams outside of their own, that will be able to enhance their skills when it comes to network performance. So, for example, if it's not something that is entailed in their day-to-day work, you can give them an activity that now makes them lead a team in terms of creating a project that now entails that they have to be able to coordinate with people from other departments that will now help in terms of building that relationship internally and also being able to collaborate with others. And as part of that activity, it also hits on having to influence others as they now, let's say, present their project to top executives. So it's a combination of collaboration, building relationships, and influence in just one activity. So what we've seen is, as we try to build the competencies of our leaders and our talent in general, what has worked greatly is exposure plus that application, direct application of learning at work. That really helps in terms of increasing performance.
Thank you once again, Det. There are a couple of questions here, but Det, I think you may have just answered the first one that came up, and that's probably your last question for the day.
Oh, okay.
What for you are the characteristics of an engaged employee?
Okay, so an engaged employee. When we talk about engagement, it's really not, we always say it's not just present or current engagement that we want to look, but future engagement. And a characteristic that I'd like it's more of like an ambassador of your organization. So in our millennial terms, sort of like an influencer. So an engaged employee is someone who talks about the organization really well and makes sure, like he talks about, let's say, your organization to his friends, someone who believes in the vision and the mission of the organization. It's not just that he's still here in your office or in your company because he likes his work, he likes his team, he likes his boss, but he's here because he loves the company, he believes in the vision of the company, he sees himself growing in the company, and when he talks about how he sees himself 3, 5 years down the road. It's always seeing himself growing within the company. So not just becoming a manager, but becoming a manager in the company that he's in. So, and then again, like an ambassador, so
someone who talks about your company to his friends, to his family, and of course, always in a positive light.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deb. Unfortunately, that's about all the time we have for questions. So, to the audience, we certainly hope that you have enjoyed today's webinar and that you have learned from it as well. Again, we thank you, Deb. We thank you, everyone, for joining in, and we hope that you can join us again in our next webinar. Thank you, and goodbye.